The government is coming under pressure to cap rail fares for another year as July inflation data signalled potential further misery ahead for commuters. The Evening Standard's deputy political editor, Jitendra Joshi, reports this would land some commuters with a 4.6% hike to their travel bills. If Labour ministers stick to the RPI-based formula used since rail privatisation, it would mean fare increases in 2025 of about 1% below current rates of wage growth, still uncomfortably high for many. And also, what's the latest with the government's plans for rail nationalisation? Why won't this necessarily mean cheaper fares for passengers already paying through the nose? To discover more, Jitendra joins us now.
What we've had this morning are inflation data for the month of July. Now, every month's inflation data for the last 2 or 3 years have been avidly watched because we've had to deal with so much pressure in the cost of living. Now, it seems that we're past the worst of that. Inflation generally is now back more or less around the 2% figure that the Bank of England is comfortable with. However, there's a particular issue with the figures for July, and that's because historically, or at least up until the cost of living crisis, governments would use the July data to set rail fares for the following year. Regulated rail fares, including season tickets on popular commuter routes in and around London. I say until the crisis because as a result of the crisis, with inflation running out of control, it felt, the government stepped in, the previous Conservative government stepped in for the last couple of years and said, actually, we're going to put a freeze on this, or we're going to put a cap on this. We're not going to let the July numbers dictate the following year's rail fares. We're going to go with a lower figure. So if they'd kept with the figure for the retail price index last July, rail fares would have gone up 9% this year. Instead, they went only, I say only, but a relatively smaller figure of 4.9%. So that was this year. The government also, when it announced that, pushed back the date for which the New Year's rail fares to take effect. So instead of that change happening on the first working day of January this year, it was postponed to the beginning of March to give people a bit more time to benefit from the older fare structure. Now, the big question, of course, now for everyone who still has to commute by train is we've got a new government, a Labour government. They're doing lots of things or saying they're going to do lots of things with the railways, including progressively ending privatisation. What does this mean for rail fares for next year? The short answer to that is we don't know yet. This morning we spoke with the Department for Transport and they stressed they haven't made a decision yet. Last time round we didn't learn the new round of rail fares until December last year, so we might have to wait a bit still this time.
What's the latest with Labour's rail nationalisation plan?
Before the recess began, the new government had introduced legislation to progressively bring rail operators back under state control. So the idea is rather than stepping in and having to pay potentially hundreds of millions or even billions in compensation to the private companies to end their contracts early, the government will wait for those contracts to reach their natural end over the next few years. And then as those end, there won't be a new tender for a new operator. Those contracts will then revert to national control, state control. Now, that's going to take a few years to play out and could well stretch into a second Labour term if they're re-elected in 4 or 5 years. But the intention there is clear that after what Labour says is the fiasco and mismanagement of privatisation, we're going to go back to a state model.
But it also appears that nationalisation won't really benefit commuters stung with sky-high prices, right?
To a large extent, we have to see. So you're right, they're being deliberately vague in terms of the promise on rail fares. This morning, we were told no decisions have been made on next year's rail fares. These are the words of a Transport Department spokesperson. Our aim is that prices are as affordable as possible for passengers. Now, affordable covers a lot of bases. So right now, if they were to proceed with today's inflation data, the retail price index stood at 3.6% in July. Historically, that figure would get another 1 percentage point added to come up with the following year's rail fares. So in other words, we'd be looking at a 4.6% increase. Now, depending on where you are, if you're travelling from Surbiton to Waterloo, for instance, an annual season ticket would go up by £69 on our calculations to just over £1,500. But if you're coming from Reading to Paddington, you're looking at, on those figures, you're looking at an increase of £258 to nearly £6,000. So, what is affordable? The figures range quite widely, and the government might want to point to the fact that wage growth actually, which was one of the big issues we had in the cost of living crisis, wages just were not going up anywhere near as much as inflation was rising. Now, finally, the situation is reversed. Wages are staying just about ahead of inflation, even though the rate of increase has slowed somewhat in the last couple of months. So the government might point to that and say, well, look, as long as inflation remains tamed and wages continue to go up, any such increase in rail fares would be affordable. I think people will generally, as much as anything, just want a reliable service, don't they? Another point to flag today on Wednesday is that the ASLEF Train Rail Union, which represents train drivers, is engaged in a second round of talks with the new government. And the mood music coming out of that is much more positive. We've had 18 rail strikes just over the last 2 years, and I'm sure you'd agree, everyone's heartily fed up of the disruption that's causing at a time when, as we've discussed, fares just go up and up. So people want, as much as anything, a good, reliable service. And if rail fares have to go up a little bit, 3 or 4%, let's say, to fund improvements, the government will be banking that's a sort of trade-off most people might be willing to go along with.